Imagine, if you will, a cramped stone chamber. It's in the turret of a gatehouse, and it is the middle of the night.
Okay.
The only light is coming from this flickering tallow candle that smells, faintly of animal fat. And shadows are dancing across a table that's just covered in strange instruments, glass lenses, astrolabes, bubbling flasks of colored liquid.
It sounds like the opening scene of a fantasy novel. Or maybe a horror movie, right before the monster jumps out.
It really does. And in the center of this room, right in the middle of all this clutter, sits a head. A life-size human head, but it's made entirely of brass.
Ah.
And the legend says, because we have to start with the legend, that this head was basically a supercomputer made of clockwork and magic.
The famous brazen head, of course.
Exactly. So the story goes that the man who built it, a friar, had spent 7 years of his life crafting it. He believed it could answer any question in the universe, any question at all. But he was so exhausted from the work that he told his assistant, "Wake me up if it speaks," and then he just collapsed into sleep.
And naturally, the assistant messes it up.
Of course he does. The head speaks 3 times. It says, "Time is." Then there's a pause. Then "time was." And finally, its last words, "Time is past."
And then it self-destructs.
With a deafening crash, the brass head shatters into 1,000 pieces.
A tragic loss of data. I mean, that's the ultimate missed voicemail of the Middle Ages.
If it were true. But that's the thing. That is the myth of the man we are talking about today. To the folklore of the 16th century, he was a wizard, a necromancer, a man who tricked the devil.
Right.
But if you open a history of science textbook today, he is something else entirely. He's the Doctor Mirabilis, the wonderful teacher.
He's the man who, in the 13th century, looked at the calendar everyone was using and said, we are doing this all wrong. He looked at how universities taught science and said, stop just reading the books and start actually looking at the world.
And he's the friar who predicted the automobile, the airplane, and the submarine, literally hundreds of years before the engine was even a concept.
It's an incredible contrast.
So today, we are unpacking the life of Roger Bacon. And the mission for this deep dive is to parse the reality from the myth. We need to figure out how a devout Franciscan friar, a man sworn to poverty and obedience, ended up becoming, well, the friend who reads too much of the 13th century.
It is a fascinating tangle, you know. You have a man who is deeply, deeply religious, yet he's credited as a pioneer of the scientific method.
Right.
He's a friar who is supposedly humble, but he goes around publicly insulting the smartest people in Europe, and he's writing these secret manuscripts for the Pope completely behind his orders back.
The sources we are diving into today are the heavy hitters. We've got the historical records of his life, the history of the Franciscan order, his massive, massive encyclopedia, the Opus Majus, and his, frankly, desperate letters to Pope Clement IV.
And I think through these documents, we're going to see a man who wasn't trying to be a wizard at all. He was trying to save the world.
So let's start at the beginning. Who was this guy before all the legends took over?
Right. So Roger Bacon was born around 1219, maybe 1220.
We don't have an exact date, do we? Like a birth certificate or anything?
No, nothing like that. Record keeping back then, well, it wasn't exactly digital. But we have a clue from Bacon himself. He wrote something in 1267 that helps us pin it down.
Oh, what does it say?
He said, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, that 40 years have passed since I first learned the alphabetum.
The alphabetum, so the alphabet. Learning his ABCs.
Well, probably a bit more than that. It likely refers to the start of his formal education, you know, the trivium and quadrivium, the basics of a medieval university education.
And kids started that when? Like in their teenage years?
Yeah, around age 13 was pretty standard. So if you do the math, 1267 minus 40 years minus another 13, you land right around 1220 for his birth year.
It's like historical detective work.
It is. And we know he was born near Ilchester in Somerset, England. And this next part is a really crucial detail that often gets glossed over in the wizard stories. His family was wealthy.
Okay, so he didn't start out as a poor begging friar. He had something of a silver spoon.
Far from poor, at least in the beginning. They were well-off landowners. But the political climate of 13th century England was, let's just call it volatile. This was the era of King Henry III.
I remember this vaguely from history class.
Yeah.
The Barons' War.
The Second Barons' War, to be precise.
Yeah.
And it was a nasty civil conflict. On one side, you had Simon de Montfort leading the rebel barons. On the other, you had King Henry III and Bacon's family. They were royal partisans. They backed the king.
And usually you'd think backing the king is the safe bet.
You'd think so. But in this case, it was a very, very expensive loyalty. During the war, the rebels seized the Bacon family's property. They drove several members of his family into exile.
Wow.
So Roger Bacon grows up in a family that sees its fortune completely collapse because of war and politics. That context is absolutely vital for understanding the rest of his life.
Why is it so vital?
Because later on, when he desperately needs money for his research, for expensive books, for lenses, for lab equipment, all of it, he can't just write home to Dad for a loan. The bank of Mom and Dad has been shuttered by the revolution. He has the taste and ambition of a wealthy scholar, but the budget of a pauper.
So, the family fortune is gone. He has to turn to the one thing they can't take away from him, his brain. And he goes to Oxford.
He does. And Oxford in the early 13th century was an incredibly exciting place. It was just starting to become a real intellectual heavyweight in Europe. And the man casting a long shadow over Oxford at that time was Robert Grosseteste.
Grosseteste. That's a great name. It sounds like big head.
It roughly translates to great head, yes. And he had a great head on his shoulders. Grosseteste was a powerhouse. He was the Bishop of Lincoln. But before that, he was a scholar who really, really pushed for using mathematics to understand the natural world.
So he wasn't just sitting around debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Oh, no, not at all. He was studying light. He had this theory that light was the first form of matter. He used geometry to explain how the world worked. Now, Bacon probably never studied under Grosseteste directly. Grosseteste likely left Oxford before Bacon arrived. But Bacon definitely attended lectures by scholars who were deeply influenced by him.
So this idea that math is the language of nature gets embedded in Bacon's brain from very early on.
Exactly. It's a foundational concept for him. And he does very well at Oxford. He becomes a master. He lectures on the standard stuff, Aristotle, logic, Latin grammar. But he also teaches arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, the more mathematical arts.
He seems to be on a pretty standard academic track for a brilliant young man.
A very successful one. And then sometime around 1237, he gets called up to the major leagues. He accepts an invitation to teach at the University of Paris.
The Sorbonne. That's the Ivy League of the 13th century.
It was the undisputed intellectual center of Europe. If you wanted to make a name for yourself, you had to go to Paris. But Bacon, well, he didn't exactly fit in with the crowd there.
Why not? Was he too English? Not enough of a philosopher?
He was too. Bacon. He was famously combative. I mean, you have to understand, the academic culture in Paris at the time was very focused on what we call scholasticism, analyzing texts, debating minute definitions, logical proofs.
And he thought that was a waste of time.
He thought a lot of it was nonsense. He thought they were intellectually lazy. He constantly criticized his contemporaries for relying on bad Latin translations of Aristotle without ever checking the original Greek or Arabic. He wanted to get back to the sources.
So he was a purist.
A very aggressive one. He famously called the reference for another incredibly important scholar, Albertus Magnus, a monstrosity.
Ouch. Albertus Magnus was a huge deal, wasn't he? They called him the universal doctor.
He was probably the most respected intellectual in Europe at the time. Calling the respect for him a monstrosity is like a junior physics professor today saying that respecting Albert Einstein is a monstrosity. It was just professional suicide.
He had a sharp tongue.
He was the guy in the seminar who would constantly interrupt the professor to correct his grammar or his translation.
We all know that guy. And nobody invites that guy to the after party.
Exactly. So he was seen as eccentric, arrogant, difficult. And then, in the late 1250s, around 1256 or 57, he makes a decision that changes everything. A decision that seems completely out of character for an arrogant, independent academic.
He joins the Franciscan order.
He becomes a friar.
Okay, let's unpack this. The Franciscans, the Order of Friars Minor, these are the followers of St. Francis of Assisi. They are known for absolute poverty, for humility, for strict obedience. They beg for their food. Why would a guy who loves expensive books and telling everyone they're wrong join a group like that?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Historians have argued about this for centuries. Some speculate he did it for purely spiritual reasons. Maybe he had a genuine midlife crisis or a deep religious conversion. There was a lot of religious fervor at the time.
Maybe he felt guilty about his arrogance and wanted to atone for it.
That's certainly possible. Or it could have been practical, a bit more cynical.
How so?
Remember the money problem. His family is ruined. The life of an independent scholar is incredibly expensive. You need to buy books, parchment, pay for lodging. If you're a friar, you don't have to worry about rent or food. The order takes care of you. It's a form of institutional support.
But he traded rent for freedom.
And he seems to have made a terrible trade if his goal was academic freedom. Because shortly after he joins, the Franciscans undergo a major internal crackdown. Around the year 1260, the order passed a statute that explicitly prohibited friars from publishing books or pamphlets without prior approval from their superiors.
That is a writer's nightmare. Total censorship.
And it gets worse for him personally. It seems Bacon was, unsurprisingly, a bit of a troublemaker within the order, too. There's evidence to suggest he was assigned menial tasks, specifically to keep him humble and limit his time for contemplation.
So they've got this genius-level intellect, and they have him scrubbing floors.
Scrubbing floors, peeling vegetables, who knows? Bacon later described this period of his life as an enforced absence from scholarly life. He felt like he was being buried alive. He's surrounded by people he thinks are intellectually inferior, and he's forbidden from writing down his groundbreaking ideas.
He must have been absolutely climbing the walls.
Desperate is the word he uses. He was desperate. But Roger Bacon doesn't give up. He hatches a plan. He needs a patron. Someone powerful enough to override his own Franciscan superiors.
And in the medieval world, there is really only one person who fits that bill.
The Pope.
Huh.
Or, in this case, a man who was about to become the Pope. Bacon manages, through a network of contacts, to get in touch with Cardinal Guy de Fouques. At the time, Guy was a papal legate, basically a high-ranking diplomat serving in England.
How does a lowly, floor-scrubbing friar even get a message to a cardinal?
With great difficulty. And this is where it leads to a complete comedy of errors. Bacon sends a messenger, a man named Raymond of Leon, to speak to Guy de Fouques on his behalf, but the message gets completely garbled in translation.
The classic game of telephone.
Exactly. Raymond, for whatever reason, miscommunicates Bacon's proposal. Guy de Fouques gets the impression that Bacon has already written a magnificent encyclopedia of all science. He thinks this great book already exists, that it's sitting on Bacon's desk, and that Bacon is just waiting for permission to send it.
But the book doesn't exist. Not even a first draft.
It exists only in Bacon's head. He was asking for funding to write it. Guy thought he was being offered a finished product. It's a huge misunderstanding.
And then the stakes go through the roof.
Dramatically. In 1265, Guy de Fouques is elected pope. He becomes Pope Clement IV.
So now the guy who thinks you have a finished copy of The Secrets of the Universe is the most powerful man in the Western world.
And he wants his book. On June 22, 1266, the new pope sends a letter directly to Bacon. He officially commissions him to write out his remedies for the current conditions of the world, for the state of education, for everything. But there is a catch. A massive catch.
What's the catch?
The Pope writes that Bacon must do this in utmost secrecy. And, this is the crucial part, he must not violate any standing prohibitions of his order.
Wait a minute. So the order says, you are forbidden from writing books. And the Pope says, write me a book, but don't tell the order you're writing it. And also, don't break the rules of the order. That's impossible. It's a contradiction.
It's a paradox. It put Bacon in an absolutely terrible bind. If he tells his superiors, hey, the Pope asked me to do this, he's breaking the Pope's direct command for secrecy. If he writes the book without telling them, he's disobeying his order's ban on publishing. It's a catch-22.
And we haven't even mentioned the money problem again.
Exactly. Parchment isn't cheap. Ink, professional copyists to make a clean version for the Pope. These things were incredibly expensive in the 13th century. It's like being asked to build a rocket ship in your basement without telling your spouse and with a budget of $0.
So what does he do? Does he just give up and write back saying, sorry, can't be done?
No. He panics, and then he works harder than perhaps anyone has ever worked in a single year. He begs and borrows money from friends. He finds sympathetic ears. And in about a year, from 1267 to 1268, Bacon produces a staggering amount of material. He writes the Opus Majus, the greater work.
And this isn't some little pamphlet. This is a doorstopper of a book.
It's around 1,000,000 words. It's an encyclopedia covering grammar, logic, mathematics, physics, experimental science, optics, alchemy, and moral philosophy.
1,000,000 words in a single year, by hand, with a quill. That's insane.
It's a practically manic level of production. And just in case that one got lost in the mail, because, the medieval mail system was about as reliable as a coin toss, he also wrote the Opus Majus, the lesser work, and the Opus Tertium, the third work, as summaries and expansions to be sent along with it.
He was hedging his bets, sending backups.
It has been called one of the most remarkable single efforts of literary productivity in history. He was literally writing for his life, for his chance to get out of obscurity.
So let's dive into the book itself, the Opus Majus. What was he actually trying to say in this 1,000,000-word plea? Was it just a data dump of everything he knew?
No, not at all. It was a manifesto. He called it a persuasive preamble. Bacon wanted nothing less than to completely reform the educational system of Christendom. He believed the church was in danger because its scholars were intellectually lazy and ignorant.
So it starts with a critique.
Start with a bang. Part 1 is titled The Causes of Human Ignorance.
I love that. He starts by telling everyone why they're stupid. It's so perfectly on brand for Roger Bacon.
It is. He identifies 4 main causes of error that hold humanity back. The first is submission to unworthy authority. The second is the influence of custom. Third is popular prejudice. And the fourth, which he thinks is the worst one, is the concealment of our own ignorance accompanied by an ostentatious display of our knowledge.
Concealment of ignorance with ostentatious display of knowledge. That sounds like he predicted social media by about 750 years.
It is a timeless critique, isn't it? He's saying, we pretend we know everything so we stop actually learning anything. But the real core of his argument, the revolutionary part, was about how we learn. He placed a huge emphasis on what he called scientia experimentalis, experimental science.
This is the line that gets him the title of the first modern scientist, right?
It is, but we have to be very careful with that label. When Bacon talks about experience, he doesn't just mean a double-blind lab experiment like we would today. For him, experience had 2 parts. One was sensory experience, observing the world with your eyes, measuring things.
The part we call science.
Yes. But the other part was interior illumination, a kind of spiritual experience or divine revelation.
So it's a blend of faith and observation.
Yeah.
He's not an atheist scientist in a lab coat by any stretch.
Not at all. He's a Franciscan friar trying to find God's truth, which he believes is revealed in 2 books, the Book of Scripture and the Book of Nature. But compared to his peers, who are mostly just arguing about what Aristotle meant in paragraph 4 of page 10, Bacon was radical. He said theories supplied by reason must be verified by sensory data. You can't just argue about it, you have to go look.
Can you give us a concrete example of how he applied this?
Optics is the absolute best example. He called it perspectiva. Bacon was obsessed with light, which ties back to Grosseteste, and he draws heavily and gives credit to the work of the great Islamic scientist Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Hazan.
The Islamic Golden Age was really the source of so much of this knowledge, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And Bacon was one of the few European scholars of his time who really recognized and celebrated that fact. He praised Islamic thinkers constantly. So he studied the anatomy of the eye, the structure of the brain, and the properties of light reflection, and crucially, refraction.
Refraction is how light bends, right? Like when you look at a straw in a glass of water and it looks broken.
Exactly. Bacon experimented with how light bends when it passes through glass lenses, and this led him to a huge insight. He realized that you could use carefully shaped lenses to make small things look big or to make distant things look close. He wrote, and this is an amazing quote, "From an incredible distance, we may read the smallest letters."
He's literally describing the telescope and the microscope.
He's describing the principle, yes. We have no evidence that he actually built a working telescope, but he understood exactly how it would work. He even suggested that lenses could be used to help old men read. He's describing reading glasses. And this work was so influential that he's considered partially responsible for getting optics added to the medieval university curriculum.
So he's not just a theorist, he's a curriculum reformer.
That was his ultimate goal. He argued that God created light as the primary way he acts in the world, so studying light was, for Bacon, a way of studying God's divine action. It was a form of worship.
And he applied this same, mathematical observational rigor to other things too. What about the calendar?
Oh, the calendar was a major source of frustration for him. He looked at the Julian calendar, the one everyone in Europe was using, established by Julius Caesar, and he called it intolerable, horrible, and laughable.
Laughable. Those are strong words for a calendar. What was so funny about it to him?
The math was wrong. The Julian calendar assumed that the year was exactly 365.25 days long. That's why we have a leap year every 4 years. But Bacon, relying on more precise Arabic astronomical data, realized the year is slightly less than that. It's about 11 minutes shorter.
11 minutes a year doesn't seem like a lot.
It doesn't, but it adds up. After 100 years, you're off by almost a day. After 1,000 years, you're off by more than a week. Bacon calculated that because of this cumulative error, the spring equinox, and therefore the date of Easter, had shifted by 9 full days since the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
And for a medieval Christian, celebrating Easter on the wrong day is not a minor inconvenience. It's a huge deal.
It's a massive theological problem. You are missing the holiest appointment of the entire year. You're fasting when you should be feasting. You're feasting when you should be fasting. The entire sacred rhythm is off. So Bacon proposed a solution.
What was it?
He said we should drop 1 day from the calendar every 125 years to correct the drift and stop relying on a fixed date for the equinox and instead rely on actual astronomical observation.
That sounds remarkably accurate.
It's extremely accurate. But did the Pope listen?
Let me guess. The proposal got filed away in a dusty Vatican drawer.
While Pope Clement IV might have listened, he was an intelligent man, but, spoiler alert, he died before he could act on it. A reform very, very similar to Bacon's, the Gregorian calendar, the one we all use today, wasn't enacted until 1582.
So he was over 300 years ahead of the curve.
3 centuries ahead. It's the tragedy of his life in a nutshell. He's standing on a rooftop yelling the right answer, but nobody down on the street is ready to hear it yet.
It's a recurring theme. But let's move to the stuff that really cemented his reputation as a wizard. Let's talk about gunpowder.
Yes, the explosions. Bacon is often cited, correctly, as the first European to record the formula for gunpowder.
He didn't invent it, right?
No, absolutely not. He didn't invent it. Gunpowder was invented in China centuries earlier. Knowledge of it had likely traveled along the Silk Road or via the expanding Mongol Empire. In fact, Bacon had a friend, a fellow Franciscan named William of Rubruck, who had actually traveled to the Mongol court and returned.
So he probably got the intel from a traveler's tale.
It's the most likely source, yes. He heard about the strange exploding powder from the east, but Bacon wasn't just a reporter, he was a scientist. He figured out what it was. In the Opus Majus and the Opus Tertium, he describes a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal.
And he described it as a toy, didn't he?
He did. He says it's a children's toy made in many parts of the world, about the size of a person's thumb.
He's describing a firecracker.
Exactly. He writes that when it bursts, it makes a horrible sound and brilliant lightning. He says it exceeds the roar of strong thunder. He perfectly captures the experience of a firecracker going off.
But he saw past the tour aspect of it, didn't he? He saw the military potential.
He absolutely did. He wrote that if you used a larger quantity of the powder and enclosed it in a container made of a solid material, the force would be devastating. He foresaw the cannon. He realized that this chemical reaction could destroy entire armies from a distance.
Now, there's a story I've heard about a secret code that Bacon hid the true recipe in an anagram or a cryptogram because it was too dangerous.
Ah, the famous cryptogram. This is a bit of a historical wild goose chase that really added to the wizard myth. In the early 20th century, a British artillery officer named Henry Heim published a book where he claimed he'd cracked a cipher in one of Bacon's letters. He said the scrambled letters spelled out the perfect ratio for military-grade gunpowder. 7 parts saltpeter, 5 parts charcoal, 5 parts sulfur.
It makes him sound like a spy, something out of the Da Vinci Code.
It does. It's a great story. But sadly, it's not true. Later historians, particularly Lym Thorndike and Joseph Needham, completely tore that theory apart. They showed that the passage Heim was decoding wasn't even written by Bacon. It was a later interpolation added by a copyist.
And the recipe itself?
The ratio Heim decoded. It wouldn't explode properly. It would just make a lot of smoke and maybe a fizzle. It wasn't the recipe for high-grade gunpowder. So the evidence is that Bacon was actually quite open about the ingredients, but he didn't hide some secret perfect recipe in a puzzle. That's just part of the legend.
But he did write about some other crazy machines.
Yeah.
This is stuff that sounds like it's straight out of science fiction.
Yes. In a letter called Epistola de Secretis, his letter on secret works, he really lets his imagination run wild. He starts predicting technologies based on his understanding of mechanics. He predicts cars that can move with inestimable force without any draft animals pulling them.
Self-driving cars.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, horseless carriages.
He predicts ships that can be steered by a single man and move faster than a galley full of rowers.
Speedboats. In the 13th century.
And most famously, flying machines. He describes a machine where a man sits in the middle, turning some kind of device or crank that makes artificial wings beat the air in the manner of a flying bird.
An ornithopter. Just like Da Vinci's sketches from centuries later.
And even submarines. He references ancient stories about Alexander the Great using diving bells or suits to walk on the ocean floor, and he argues that such devices are mechanically possible.
Now, to be clear, did he have blueprints for these? Did he have a secret workshop where he was building a helicopter prototype?
No, not at all. These were speculative. They were thought experiments. He was arguing from principle. He was saying, look, nature has forces. Art, and by art he means engineering and technology, can harness those forces. If we understand the laws of mechanics, then these things are possible.
That is a huge mental leap, though. Most people in the 13th century would look at a bird and say, God made it fly, it's a miracle. Bacon looked at a bird and said, it's a machine. If I can build a machine that pushes air the same way, I can fly too.
It's the birth of the mechanical worldview. He's moving away from explaining things as just magic and toward explaining them as mechanics.
But he wasn't purely a nuts and bolts guy. We have to talk about the more esoteric side of his work. Linguistics and alchemy seem to sit weirdly next to all this science.
And for Bacon, they weren't weird at all. They were just as important as the machines, maybe even more so. Let's look at linguistics first. Bacon was obsessed with the idea that the Bible and the works of Aristotle were being corrupted by generations of bad translations.
The classic lost in translation problem.
He believed it was a crisis. He advocated that theologians and philosophers absolutely needed to learn the original languages, Hebrew and Greek for the Bible, and Arabic for the best scientific and philosophical texts. He even went so far as to write his own Greek and Hebrew grammars to help people learn.
He wanted scholars to be able to read the source code, so to speak.
That's a perfect way to put it. And this led him to this incredible theory about universal grammar. He said, quote, "Grammar is one and the same in all languages, substantially, though it may vary accidentally."
Meaning that deep down, all human languages share a common DNA, a common structure.
Which is a profoundly modern idea. Noam Chomsky would be nodding right along with that. Bacon was trying to find the underlying theoretical structure of communication itself.
Okay, so linguistics I can see fitting in.
Yeah.
But what about alchemy? That feels like it contradicts the science. We tend to think of alchemy as, greedy con artists in pointy hats trying to turn lead into gold.
To us, yes. To him, no. For a medieval thinker like Bacon, alchemy was the pinnacle of natural science. It was the science of transformation. He followed the common Arabian theory that all metals are made of two primary components, mercury and sulfur, mixed in different proportions and purities.
So gold is just lead, but with a better, pure balance of ingredients.
Exactly. And if you could figure out how to purify the base ingredients in lead and rebalance them, you could transmute it into gold. But for Bacon, this was never just about getting rich. It was deeply spiritual.
How so?
He believed in what he called sapientia, divine wisdom. And he thought that the physical process of purifying metals in a lab was analogous to the spiritual process of purifying the human soul. The alchemist was participating in God's creative and perfecting work.
So the alchemist is like a priest of nature.
In a way, yes. This all ties into another text he was obsessed with, a book called The Secret of Secrets. Bacon believed it was a lost book written by Aristotle for his student, Alexander the Great.
But it wasn't.
It wasn't. It was actually an Islamic mirror of princes, a kind of political advice manual on how to be a good ruler. But because Bacon thought it was from Aristotle, he took its advice very seriously, and it influenced his belief that the state, the church, and the crown should be using science and alchemy to govern more effectively and to protect itself.
So he writes this massive work, the Opus Majus. He pulls it all together, he sends it off to the Pope, he includes the gunpowder, the optics, the calendar reform, the grammar, the alchemy. He ships it off to Rome in 1268. He is betting his entire career, his entire life on this manuscript. What happens?
Disaster. Absolute disaster.
Don't tell me the ship sank and it's at the bottom of the Mediterranean.
Worse, the book arrived safely, but the Pope died. Clement IV died in November of 1268, probably before he ever had a chance to read Bacon's work in any detail.
Oh, that is just heartbreaking after all that work.
It really is. Bacon lost his only protector. The one man in the world who had the authority to implement these reforms, the one man who had authorized Bacon to break the rules of his order, was gone.
And Bacon is left completely exposed.
He's a friar who has now written forbidden books. He's a scholar who has spent years insulting all of his powerful colleagues, and now he has no patron. The political winds were also changing within the church.
Things were getting more conservative.
Yes. In 1277, the Bishop of Paris issued a famous condemnation of 219 philosophical and theological propositions. They were cracking down on certain interpretations of Aristotle, on deterministic astrology, on anything that smelled like it was limiting God's free will.
And Bacon's work smelled a lot like all of those things.
He was right in the crosshairs. And this leads to the next chapter of his life, or at least the legend of it, his imprisonment. The traditional narrative, the one you'll read in older books, is that in the late 1270s, The minister general of the Franciscans, a man named Jerome of Ascoli, threw Bacon in jail for suspected novelties.
Suspected novelties. That sounds like a crime in a dystopian novel. You're accused of having new ideas.
It does, and for a long time, historians believed he was thrown in a dungeon and spent over a decade there until Jerome of Ascoli, who later became Pope Nicholas IV, died. But modern scholarship has cast a lot of doubt on this story.
Really? So he might not have been imprisoned at all.
Well, the story might be an exaggeration. The first reference we have to this imprisonment doesn't appear in any document until 80 years after Bacon's death. That's a long time. Many modern scholars think the imprisonment might have been a less dramatic form of house arrest, or perhaps just a continuation of the strict restrictions he was already under, a command for silence.
If it wasn't for the science, why would they target him so severely?
It might have been internal Franciscan politics. There was a huge, bitter split happening in the order at the time. One group, the spirituals, believed in absolute radical poverty, just like St. Francis. They thought the order was getting too rich and powerful. The other group, the conventuals, were more pragmatic and were okay with the order owning property and buildings.
And let me guess where Bacon stood.
Bacon was a radical. He sympathized strongly with the strict poverty group. It's very possible he was silenced not because of his science, but because he was a vocal and troublesome supporter of a radical faction in the internal politics of his own order. It was his personality and his politics, not just his ideas, that got him into trouble.
So what happens in his final years? Is he just locked away in silence?
The details are murky, but he seems to have been allowed to return to Oxford after 1278. He wrote one last work in 1292, the Compendium Studii Theologiae. And it's kind of a sad book, really. It doesn't add much that's new. It's mostly him complaining about the same old corruptions and errors that he'd been fighting against his whole life.
He sounds tired.
He sounds defeated. He died sometime around 1292 and was buried at the Franciscan Church in Oxford.
But death is really just the beginning of his second career. His career as a legend.
Precisely. The historical man dies, but the wizard is born.
Why did that happen? Why did he become a wizard in the public imagination instead of a failed reformer?
Because the things he did looked like magic to ordinary people. He was a bit of a recluse. He lived in what legend called a study on a bridge. It looked like a tower. He worked with strange instruments, lenses, and mirrors. He knew about explosives. To the uneducated peasant, or even the uneducated noble of the time, that all looks exactly like magic.
And so the brazen head story takes off.
It becomes his defining myth. By the 16th century, the playwright Robert Greene writes a very famous play, The Honorable History of Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay. And in that play, Bacon is a full-on necromancer. He conjures devils, he has magic contests, he tries to build a brass wall around England to protect it from invaders.
It's basically superhero fan fiction from the 1500s.
It is. But it was incredibly popular, and it defined his public image for centuries. Friar Bacon became a stock character, the brilliant but foolish magician who meddles with forces he can't control and is ultimately humbled.
So when did that perception change? When did he get rehabilitated and become a scientist again?
That really happened in the 19th century during the Victorian era. Scholars at that time were looking for historical heroes. They were very invested in the idea that history was a long battle between science and religion.
A conflict thesis.
Exactly. And they looked back at Roger Bacon and saw a perfect martyr for their cause. They said, look, he was a man of reason, a true scientist, trapped in the superstitious Dark Ages. He was persecuted by the church for his genius. He predicted the car. He invented the scientific method.
They turned him into a modern man who was just wearing the wrong clothes, a time traveler.
They projected their own values back onto him. They tended to ignore the alchemy, the astrology, the deeply held theology, and they just cherry-picked the science bits that looked familiar to them.
But the reality, as we've been discussing, is so much more complicated and interesting than that.
The modern view, the 21st century view from historians like David Lindbergh, is that Bacon was thoroughly and completely a man of the Middle Ages. He wasn't a time traveler. He believed in the authority of the church. He believed the Bible was the ultimate source of truth.
But he also believed that understanding the natural world was a way to better serve God.
Yes. And here's the part that really blows my mind, the part that ties it all together. Bacon wasn't developing gunpowder or predicting flying machines just to make life easier for people.
He wasn't trying to invent a more convenient commute to work.
No, not at all. He was preparing for war. He was preparing for the apocalypse.
The apocalypse.
He believed, like many in his time, that the Antichrist was coming and coming soon. He believed that the enemies of Christendom, the Mongols, the Saracens, the forces of the Antichrist, would use advanced knowledge, what he called magic or advanced mechanics, to try and defeat the church. Bacon wanted the church to have those weapons first.
So this is an arms race.
It was a theological arms race. He wanted optics and astronomy and gunpowder to be used in defense of the faith.
So the flying machines and the horseless carriages weren't for convenience. They were tanks and bombers for the armies of God in the final battle.
In a way, yes. He writes explicitly about how arrays of mirrors could be used to burn enemy camps from a distance, like an ancient death ray. He writes about how explosives could be used to scatter armies and terrify them. His entire scientific program was, at its core, a project of Christian apologetics and defense.
Now, that puts a very, very different spin on the first scientist label. He wasn't trying to build our modern world. He was trying to save his medieval one from the end times.
It is the supreme irony of his life. He advocated for the very tools, empirical science, technology, a mechanical worldview, that would eventually dismantle the medieval worldview he was so desperately trying to protect.
He pushed the snowball down the hill, not knowing it would turn into an avalanche that would bury his own philosophy.
That is the beauty and the tragedy of Roger Bacon. He stands at a crossroads. He has one foot planted firmly in the world of saints and demons and divine revelation, and the other foot is stepping into the world of engines and telescopes and mathematical physics.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what is the key takeaway? Why should we still care about a grumpy 13th century friar who failed to get his book published on time?
I think we care because of his intellectual courage. He had the courage to say, I need to see it for myself. In an age of conformity and appeals to authority, he was a relentless critical thinker. He challenged the bad translations, he challenged the broken calendar, he even challenged the physics of Aristotle when his own experiments showed different results.
And he paid the price for it. He died in obscurity, without glory.
He did. But he also left a profound legacy. He helped put optics on the map in Europe. He kept the flame of Greek and Arabic science alive in the West when many others were ignoring it. And he dreamt big. He dreamt of a world where humanity wasn't limited by its own muscles, but could fly and dive and travel at incredible speeds.
He was a dreamer who did the math.
That's a great way to put it.
And here's a provocative thought to leave you with. Roger Bacon worked himself to the bone to create a scientific and technological defense for Christendom against what he believed was the coming Antichrist. He thought he was building spiritual armor. But the very things he championed, gunpowder, mechanics, empirical science, ended up building the modern, secular, industrial world that largely left his worldview behind.
The law of unintended consequences on a civilizational scale.
Exactly. So if we look back at our own scientific pioneers in 700 years, the people building artificial intelligence right now or editing genes with CRISPR or trying to colonize Mars, will we misunderstand their motivations just as much as Bacon's were misunderstood?
Will future generations turn our scientists into wizards and magicians with strange myths? Or will they see them as the high priests of a new religion we can't even recognize yet?
Or will they realize they were just people like Bacon trying to save the world from their own version of the Antichrist, and we just didn't understand the language they were speaking?
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? We are all trapped in our own context, just like he was.